Thanks very much. So, what I wanted to talk to you about today was, well, I've called my presentation Lives Mapped Out because for some children in our communities, this is exactly what seems to happen. Their lives are mapped out, but it's not in a positive way. But slide number 2, please, Natalie. So who am I talking about today? I want to talk to you about a small number of girls who share similar life experiences, including physical and sexual abuse and neglect and living with domestic abuse, and who end up being taken into care. And I want to specifically focus on what happens to some of those girls when they become mothers. Next slide, please. These girls experience trauma and abuse and eventually come into the care system. They form connections with violent males, often in quick succession, and they get pregnant when they're very young. In some cases, when they're still looked after children themselves, so at the age of 14, 15, 16. Then their own children become the subjects of child protection arrangements, usually because of neglect and the threat posed by violent males, and the children may be removed from their care. Or, even worse, their children become subjects of serious case reviews because they've either been seriously harmed or have died. And in my role as a serious case reviewer over the past 10 years, I noticed that this was a definite pattern for some girls and their own children. So I started to do some thinking and some research. Next slide, please. And this is what I found. This first statistic is horrific. It backs up what my own observations have been. So the child of a looked after child is 66 times more likely to be taken into care than the child of a non-looked after mother. The second point was based on my own observations in carrying out serious case reviews, that the children of looked after children are overrepresented in serious case reviews. This was verified after we carried out a freedom of information exercise in 2019. I just thought, how can this be right? Why isn't everyone jumping up and down in horror at this? And what's going wrong? But it's also interesting, very interesting, that the government don't collect data on the number of looked after children who are taken into care, or the children of looked after children, sorry, who are taken into care or who become subjects of serious case reviews. There's no follow-up for looked after children who become pregnant. I don't understand why this is the case, but there might also be a wider issue here. And it's what previous speakers have talked about, is the issue of class and gender and poverty. These girls are amongst the least empowered and visible people in our society. And what happens to them and their babies is not that interesting or important. Think back to Brian Fisher's presentation earlier this afternoon and what he said about control and power. And well, nearly every other speaker actually has spoken about control and power. Next slide, please. So currently, the government don't collect data on the number of looked after children who become pregnant or who become fathers, for that matter. In fact, we don't even know where 17% of young people are when they leave care, much less whether or not they have children of their own. Next slide, please. So this data gap doesn't end there. So currently there's no data collected about multi-generational care involvement either by the government. Wouldn't it make sense to at least understand the scale of the issue if we're going to tackle it? So by intergenerational cycle of local authority care, I mean when one family have more than 3 generations in some cases coming into the care system. And this relatively small number of families experience disproportionate disadvantage with significant numbers of children, if you think about it, over 3 generations in some cases, coming into the care system. And these families are well known to multiple agencies in their communities, and there's a tolerance almost that this is just how things are for this family. Next slide, please, Natalie. I wanted to tell you about one example really of multi-generational trauma. This is Ruth's story. And the similarities between the histories of the mother, Ruth, and her own mother really struck me. They shared experiences of loss and neglect and abuse and sexual exploitation in Ruth's case, becoming a looked after child, early motherhood, and relationships with abusive and very, very dangerous men. So Ruth's mother was herself a looked after child, and she was so afraid of her dad that she'd wet herself when he came home. Ruth was taken into care at 13, and she was described as promiscuous at that age, when in fact she was being sexually exploited. So she had her first child at 16 to a 33-year-old and went on to have more children. And then her children were removed following the death of her youngest child. And she was at that time in a relationship with a known very violent man. And all children were removed, who became the third generation of Ruth's family to be taken into care. I just think, what are your feelings about Ruth and her mum? And what about the children who were removed, the 4 of them? What do we think will happen when they have their own children? Will they be able to breeze through parenthood after all the trauma and abuse they experienced and witnessed? But what also struck me about Ruth's case was just how demonized she became. At what point did she become bad and dangerous? Was it when she was 8 or 10 or 13? Because this is who Ruth is, and this is who the baby was who was killed. Can we have the next slide, please, Natalie? Thank you. So just think back to Ruth's story. She was afraid for most of her childhood. And just think about how demonized when she was when her baby was killed. And she failed to protect him from her new violent partner. And what strikes me about Tracy Connolly, which is baby P's mum, Ruth, in other words, is how demonized she still is. And just how many of us know her face. And the response we have to seeing her photograph will be, how could she have let that happen to her baby? But I think it's just so interesting that very, very few people will know the name of or remember the face of the man who killed baby Peter. Why is that? We demonized her, but he could pass us in the street and we wouldn't recognize him. He was called Stephen Barker, by the way, and his own childhood was pretty horrific. Thank you. Next slide, please. So that's just one example, horrific example of intergenerational trauma and abuse, but there are plenty more. We talk about intergenerational damage all the time. It's transmitted from one generation to the next, right? We all know families where they just seem to be trouble and have trouble. But this is mirrored by intergenerational system damage. If we've got 3 generations of the same family becoming looked after, then how many professionals have worked with those families over those 3 generations? Hundreds. And how many will have worked with both mother and her own children as they become adults and parents? Certainly, I've spoken to practitioners who remember both mother and daughter when they were looked after children. So what does that say about our response, our practice, and how ineffective it is? How can we not question what we're doing? How can we not question whether in fact we're making a difference or actually making things worse? Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, it can't just be one thing. It has to be a multitude of things that we do consciously. But at the core of what we do must be the fact that girls who become pregnant at 14, 15, 16, whilst they are still looked after children or as care leavers, are still children themselves. And they have a right to support and treatment which takes that into account in a positive rather than a punitive way. And that means we have to address and acknowledge the impact of childhood trauma, especially the impact on how we become parents. And from the moment they become pregnant, the perception of the girls changes. There'll be a pre-birth assessment of their ability to parent their child. That doesn't happen for non-looked after children. Decisions will be made about their child's future, and at the very best, support will be put in place for this 15 or 16-year-old girl to live independently with her child. But the clock is ticking and it's waiting for the disaster to happen, and happen it will, because we don't treat that girl as if she was our own child. We don't provide a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week loving support and show her gently, leading by example, what good, safe parenting looks and feels like. So what chance are we giving her? We set her up to fail, we compound the damage and the trauma she's already experienced, and we remove her child. And in some cases, each time she gets pregnant, we remove each child, and we don't get it right. So we do need a radical rethink about this cohort of young girls. And we have as much to learn from the girls who do go on to become happy and secure mothers as we do from the small but very important number of girls who do not. So thank you very much for listening. That's the end of my depressing, I'm sure, PowerPoint. Thank you.